Today we will be talking about Azure Virtual Networking. We can create Azure Virtual Network which allows Azure resources such as virtual machines, web apps, and databases to talk to each other. Using Azure Virtual Network, not only Azure resources can talk to each other, they can interact with users over the internet, and also they can talk to resources on our on premises. There are some time scenarios where we may be deploying our web application in a cloud computing environment, Azure, and our databases may be on our premises. So in that way, we have to create a hybrid network where Azure resources web app is talking to databases. So we will be talking about the different capabilities of Azure Virtual Network. First thing is isolation and segmentation. Using Azure Virtual Network, we can create isolated networks of Azure resources. So these Azure resources will be using some public IP address or private IP address, but this IP address won't be visible out of these networks. They will be using these IP addresses and subnets to talk to each other resources within that network, within that Azure Virtual Network. Also we can use IP addresses, or we can divide these IP addresses into subnets and assign these address spaces to these subnets to make sure that we create a virtual network. And we can use either the DNS services provided by the Azure, or we can use some outside DNS services. The second important aspect of Azure Virtual Network is it allows our web apps, virtual machines to be available to the users over the internet. Either we can publish an IP address, or we can create these resources behind a load balancer, and this load balancer can be set to the public. That way we can publish our applications, we can publish our websites, we can create virtual machines and work access these virtual machines over HTTP, HTTPS. As we discussed, Azure Virtual Network allows Azure virtual resources to talk to each other. Not only they can talk to other Azure virtual resources, they can talk to Power Apps, Azure Kubernetes, and Azure uh, scale set, virtual machine scale sets. Also, we can define public endpoints, and these public endpoints can be used by other applications to access databases, storage points. This way we can optimize the security of the virtual machines so that only the authenticated people can access these resources. Azure Virtual Network can communicate with our on-premises resources. As I discussed before, there may be some scenarios where Azure resources have to talk to our resources on our premises. For example, we may not be comfortable moving our databases to Azure computing environment, whereas we may be deploying the websites. So that in that scenario, the websites has to talk to databases on our premises. So there are three ways that Azure resources can talk to resources on premises. The first is point to site. In this mechanism, the computer outside the resources initiate the VPN access to Azure resources. The second mechanism is site to site. In this mechanism, Azure VPN can talk to on-premises VPN. This way, the Azure resource will look like any other resource to our network, and the communication between both both resources is encrypted over the internet. There's another way of doing it using Azure Express route. In Azure Express route, you don't go talk to Azure resources over the internet. You use a Microsoft infrastructure to talk to create a communication between Azure resources and on-premises resources. By default, Azure routes the traffic between the subnets for any connected Azure Virtual Networks or on-premises resources and internet. But we can define route tables which will guide how the traffic will be transferred between the subnets. Also, we can use border. Also, we can use border gateway protocols to connect our on-premises VPN gateways to Azure gateway. So this way, all our BGP routing rules can be exported to Azure VPN. The sixth capability is we can filter the traffic. We can define resources such as network security, which will guide how the traffic moves between different IP addresses, ports, and protocols. Let's do an exercise which demonstrate Azure Virtual Networking rules. So for that, we have to create a virtual machine. Let's create the virtual machine from this lab only, the previous lab. Once we create the virtual machine, it's running. I'm using Sandbox. This comes with Microsoft examples. Once you have Hotmail or Gmail, Hotmail or GitHub account, you can use this Sandbox. So I am setting up an index on my virtual machine. So you can just copy the command and run on this Azure Cloud Shell. So once virtual machine is set up, we can play to set up some inbound security rules on this virtual machine. So we are all set for our next exercise, which is configure network access. So we have created a virtual machine and there's a web server. We will try to access our web server on virtual machine. So for that there is a command. We'll copy this command and using curl command we'll try to run it. We get failed to connect to our virtual machine on port 80, which is HTTP port. This is our IP address. Let's try to access the website using our IP address. And so I'll copy the IP address and paste in my browser. So it's trying to access my virtual machine on through HTTP or HTTPS, and the site cannot be reached. So we have confirmed okay, HTTP port 80 is not open. So let's see the list of network security rules. So we can copy the command, and that is list. That is and that give me the virtual machine name. Now I can see all the security rules on this virtual machine. So we can see the port 80 is not open right now. The port 22.2 is only open. Port 80 is not open. So I'm going to run the command to make sure that port 80 is open. So let's see. Now we see port 80 is open, and let me connect to my virtual machine on Azure Network. So it's taking time. Still it has not loaded. Let me refresh once more. It takes some couple of seconds to our rules to kick in. And okay, refresh. Now I am able to reach my website. That concludes our exercise. Thanks for